The needle slipped through Penelope Fairbanks's calloused fingers for the third time that morning, leaving a bright bead of blood on the worn fabric she was mending, and she wondered if she would ever finish the mountain of torn shirts and trousers that seemed to grow taller with each passing day. The autumn sun of 1882 filtered through the single window of her cramped room above the general store in Wilson, Kansas, casting long shadows across the pile of work that represented her only means of survival since tuberculosis had claimed her husband Thomas 2 years earlier. At 24, she had already buried one love and resigned herself to a life of solitude and threadbare existence, her days measured in stitches and copper coins that barely kept hunger at bay. The knock on her door came just after noon, unexpected and forceful enough to make her jump. Penelope set down the patched trousers she had been working on and crossed the small room, her simple gray dress swishing against the uneven floorboards. She opened the door to find a man unlike any she had encountered in Wilson's dusty streets. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered beneath a worn leather duster that had seen countless miles of prairie wind and rain. His hat shadowed eyes that were startlingly green, and dark stubble covered a strong jaw. Most notably, slung over his shoulder was a bulging canvas sack that looked heavy enough to require 2 men to carry. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the doorframe. "Name's Ryder McCormick. I heard tell you do mending work." Penelope nodded slowly, taking in the trail dust that covered his boots and the weariness that lined his face despite his obvious youth. He could not have been much older than 30, yet something in his bearing spoke of hard years and harder choices. "I do, Mr. McCormick. Though I should warn you my prices are fair but firm, 5 cents for simple repairs, more for extensive work." To her surprise, he dropped the canvas sack at her feet with a heavy thud that shook the threshold. "I have money, madam, more than enough. What I need is someone who can handle this." He gestured to the sack, and when Penelope bent to examine its contents, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was clothing in such a state of disrepair that it seemed a miracle anyone had worn these garments at all. Shirts with sleeves torn clean off, trousers with holes large enough to fit a fist through, socks that were more air than fabric, and undergarments that had clearly not been mended in years. There must have been 50 pieces at least, maybe more, all belonging to one very neglectful or very unfortunate cowboy. "This is everything you own, is it not?" Penelope asked, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. Ryder McCormick had the decency to look embarrassed, color rising beneath his tan. "Been on the trail for 5 years straight, madam. Riding for various outfits, following the cattle from Texas to Kansas and back again. Never had much time for such things as proper upkeep. Then my last shirt gave out 2 days ago, and I realized I was down to nothing but rags and prayers." He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and set it beside the sack. When it clinked, Penelope recognized the sound of silver dollars. "I can pay up front, whatever it takes. I just need clothes that will last me through the winter." Penelope stared at the sack, then at the money, then back at the tall cowboy who stood waiting with an expression that might have been hopeful if not for the pride that kept his shoulders squared and his chin high. She had never seen so much work in one place, nor had she ever been offered such an opportunity. This was enough mending to keep her occupied for weeks, maybe months if she took her time and did the work properly. The money he offered could mean the difference between surviving the winter and succumbing to the same fate that had claimed her husband. "You understand this will take considerable time," she said carefully. "I work alone, and I will not rush the job just to finish quickly. If you need these garments soon, you would be better served buying new." "I understand, madam, and I am in no rush. My riding days are done for now. I have taken a position at the Harrison Ranch just outside town, working their horses through the winter months. I will be here in Wilson until spring at least, maybe longer." He paused, then added quietly, "I would rather have these clothes mended proper than buy new. They have been with me a long time. Seems a shame to abandon them when they just need a bit of care." Something in his words touched a chord deep in Penelope's chest, a resonance she had not felt since Thomas's death. She recognized the sentiment of someone who valued what they had, who understood that broken things could be made whole again with patience and effort. It was a philosophy she had applied to her own life these past 2 years, stitching together her shattered existence one day at a time. "Very well, Mr. McCormick. I will take the work, but I must be honest with you about the cost. This is easily 3 months of labor, perhaps 4. At fair prices, you are looking at $15, maybe 20. Ryder McCormick did not hesitate. He opened the leather pouch and counted out 25 silver dollars, stacking them carefully on the small table beside Penelope's sewing basket. "25, madam. The extra is for taking on such a burden all at once, and for doing it right. I have been making do with poorly done work for too long. I want quality." Penelope felt her throat tighten at the sight of so much money. $25 was more than she typically earned in half a year. It was enough to pay her rent through spring, buy proper food, maybe even get a new coat before the Kansas winter turned brutal. Yet accepting it felt almost dishonest, as though she were taking advantage of this stranger's desperation. "This is too much," she said softly. "It is exactly right," Ryder replied, his green eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her look away. "I know the value of good work, madam, and I know what it means to struggle to make ends meet. If my money can help you while you help me, then we both come out ahead." Before Penelope could protest further, he tipped his hat and turned to leave, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs that led down to the street. She stood in the doorway, watching his broad back disappear around the corner, the canvas sack at her feet and a small fortune in silver on her table. The work began that very afternoon. Penelope emptied the sack and sorted the garments by the severity of their damage. Some pieces merely needed buttons replaced or seams reinforced. Others required entire panels of fabric to be cut and sewn, effectively rebuilding the garment from scratch. She had never seen such consistent wear and tear, the kind that came from years of hard living without respite or care. Each hole and tear told a story. A branch caught during a midnight cattle drive, barbed wire crossed in darkness, the constant friction of saddle and rope and endless hours of physical labor. As she worked through that first week, Penelope found herself thinking about Ryder McCormick more than was strictly proper. She wondered about the life that had worn his clothes to such a state, about the 5 years he had spent on the trail following cattle across the endless prairie. She wondered what had brought him to Wilson, and what had made him decide to settle, even temporarily, after so long spent moving. Most of all, she wondered why a man who clearly had the means to buy new clothing would instead choose to salvage what he already owned. On the 8th day, he returned. Penelope was bent over a particularly challenging repair, trying to graft a new sleeve onto a shirt that had lost its original to what looked like a cooking fire, when the knock came. She had fallen into such a rhythm with her work that she had lost track of time, and the autumn light streaming through her window had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon. She opened the door to find Ryder McCormick standing there with his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mr. McCormick," she said, surprised, "I did not expect you so soon. The work is progressing well, but I am nowhere near finished." "I know, madam. I did not come to check on the progress." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture that seemed at odds with his imposing size. "Truth is, I was wondering if you might join me for supper this evening. There is a decent restaurant down by the train depot, and I thought perhaps you might appreciate a meal you did not have to cook yourself." Penelope felt her heart skip in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She had not been to dinner with a man since Thomas died, had not even considered such a thing possible. Her life had narrowed to the small room above the general store, the endless parade of mending work, and the quiet evening spent alone with her memories. The thought of stepping outside that carefully constructed boundary was enough to make her palms sweat. "I do not think that would be appropriate," she said, even as part of her yearned to say yes. "Why not?" Ryder asked, and there was no challenge in his voice, only genuine curiosity. "You are a widow, not a nun, and I am simply a man asking a woman to share a meal. There is no impropriety in that, surely." "People talk in small towns, Mr. McCormick. They would have us married by Sunday if I were seen dining with you. Let them talk." He met her eyes with that same intensity she had noticed during their first meeting. "I have spent 5 years caring too much about what people thought, trying to live up to expectations that were never mine to begin with. I am tired of it, madam. I would like to have supper with you, because I find myself thinking about you far more than is probably wise for a man who has known you for barely a week. If that makes me forward, so be it." The honesty in his words cut through Penelope's defenses like a hot knife through butter. She stood there in the doorway, her needle-pricked fingers clutching the doorframe, and realized that she wanted to say yes more than she had wanted anything in 2 long years. Life had been about survival for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to actually want something, to reach for a moment of happiness rather than simply enduring. "Give me 20 minutes to make myself presentable," she said quietly. Ryder's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. "Take all the time you need, madam. I will be waiting right here." Penelope closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked down at her gray dress, stained with thread and spotted with the evidence of her work, and realized she had nothing better to wear. Everything she owned was practical and plain, designed for labor rather than leisure. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered the trunk beneath her bed, the one she had not opened since packing away Thomas's things. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and smelling of lavender, was a dress she had not worn in 3 years. It was deep blue, the color of the sky just after sunset, with small pearl buttons up the front and lace at the collar and cuffs. Thomas had bought it for her on their first anniversary, before the sickness came, when they had still believed in futures that stretched beyond the next harvest. She had packed it away after his death, unable to bear the sight of something so beautiful in a world that had become so gray. Now, standing in her small room with Ryder McCormick waiting outside, Penelope pulled the dress from its tissue paper nest and held it up to the fading light. The fabric was still good, the color still rich. She had been 21 when she wore it last, young and full of hope. At 24, she felt ancient by comparison, weathered by grief and hardship. Yet as she slipped the dress over her head and felt the smooth fabric against her skin, something shifted inside her chest. The dress still fit perfectly, as though the years had not passed at all. She brushed out her dark hair and pinned it up properly, then studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin. The woman looking back at her was still recognizable, but there was color in her cheeks now, a brightness in her brown eyes that had been absent for too long. She looked, Penelope realized with some surprise, alive. When she opened the door, Ryder McCormick's expression was worth every moment of anxiety. He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, his green eyes wide with something that might have been awe. "Madam," he said, his voice rough, "you look absolutely beautiful." "Thank you," Penelope said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "And please call me Penelope. If we are to have dinner together, we can dispense with the formalities." "Penelope," he repeated, as though testing the shape of her name. "That is a lovely name. And you must call me Ryder. Mr. McCormick makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and attending church." They walked together through the streets of Wilson as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too vivid to be real. The restaurant by the train depot was nothing fancy, just a simple establishment with checkered tablecloths and the smell of home cooking drifting from the kitchen. But to Penelope, it might as well have been a palace. She could not remember the last time someone else had cooked for her, the last time she had sat down to a meal without the weight of worry pressing down on her shoulders. Ryder ordered roast chicken with potatoes and vegetables, and Penelope did the same. As they waited for the food, he told her about his life on the trail, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about rivers crossed and storms endured and cattle drives that stretched across landscapes so vast they seemed to go on forever. He spoke of loneliness too, of the ache that came from never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, of watching other men build families and futures while he remained trapped in a cycle of movement and impermanence. "Why did you finally stop?" Penelope asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "What changed?" Ryder was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "My father died," he said at last. "Last spring. I got word while we were driving a herd up from Texas. He had been sick for a while, but I did not know. We had not spoken in years, not since I left home to prove I could make it on my own." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I rode hard to get back, but I was 3 days too late. They had already buried him by the time I arrived." "I am so sorry," Penelope said softly, her hand moving across the table to cover his without thought. The contact sent a shock through her, but she did not pull away. "Thank you. It was a hard thing, harder than I expected. But it made me realize I had been running for 5 years from a life I thought I did not want, only to discover that what I really did not want was to die alone, and far from anyone who cared. My father spent his whole life building something, a ranch and a legacy, and I threw it away because I was young and stupid and thought I knew better. Now he is gone, and I cannot get that time back. So you came here to start over, something like that." The Harrison Ranch needed someone who knew horses, and I needed somewhere to be for a while, somewhere to figure out what comes next. He turned his hand over beneath hers, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "And then I met you, and suddenly the future does not seem quite so uncertain." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, emotion welling up from a place she had thought sealed off forever. "You do not know me, Ryder. You know nothing about me beyond the fact that I can mend your clothes." "Then tell me," he said simply. "Tell me everything." So she did. Over roast chicken and coffee that went cold as they talked, Penelope told Ryder McCormick about her life. She spoke of growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She told him about meeting Thomas Fairbanks when she was 19, how he had courted her with wildflowers and promises of a good life in Kansas. She described their brief marriage, the happiness they had found in Wilson before tuberculosis came like a thief in the night and stole him away piece by piece over the course of 6 terrible months. "I nursed him until the end," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I sat beside his bed and held his hand and watched him fade. When he died, I thought I would die too. The grief was so heavy I could barely breathe beneath it, but I did not die. I kept waking up, day after day, and eventually I realized I had to find a way to keep living. So you took in mending work, Ryder said. It was all I knew how to do. My mother taught me to sew before I could read. It is not much, but it keeps me fed and housed, and it gives me a purpose, I suppose. Something to do with my hands, a way to fix broken things even if I cannot fix myself. Ryder squeezed her hand gently. You are not broken, Penelope. You are surviving. There is a strength in that, a resilience that most people never have to discover. You should be proud of what you have built from the ashes of your loss. His words unlocked something inside her, a dam that had been holding back 2 years of unshed tears. Penelope found herself crying there in the restaurant, silent tears streaming down her face while Ryder held her hand and waited patiently for the storm to pass. When she finally regained her composure, he offered her his handkerchief without comment, allowing her the dignity of her grief without trying to diminish or dismiss it. Thank you, she said, dabbing at her eyes. I apologize for the display. Never apologize for feeling things, Ryder replied. God knows I spent too many years trying not to feel anything at all. It does not work, and it only makes things harder in the end. They stayed at the restaurant until the owner began to give them pointed looks, and even then, Ryder seemed reluctant to let the evening end. He walked Penelope back to her room above the general store, moving slowly through the cool autumn night as though they had all the time in the world. When they reached her door, he stood there for a long moment, his hat in his hands once more. May I call on you again? He asked. Not just to check on my clothes, but to see you. Penelope felt her heart race with a mixture of fear and hope so intense it was almost painful. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. Ryder smiled, and in the moonlight his eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Good. Because I meant what I said earlier. I cannot stop thinking about you, Penelope Fairbanks, and I do not particularly want to stop. He left her there on the threshold, and Penelope went inside to find her small room transformed by the simple act of having something to look forward to. The pile of mending that had seemed so overwhelming that morning now represented a connection to the man who had brought it. Each shirt and pair of trousers, a tangible link between them. She worked late into the night, her needle flying through fabric with renewed energy, and found herself humming songs she had not thought of in years. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt almost like a dance. Ryder came to visit every few days, sometimes bringing small gifts, fresh bread from the bakery or apples from the Harrison Ranch orchards. Other times just bringing himself and the conversation that flowed so easily between them. Penelope continued her work on his clothes, taking pleasure in each repair completed, each garment restored to usefulness. She began to understand the man through his wardrobe, seeing where his life had left its marks, and carefully erasing the evidence of hardship with skilled stitches and patient labor. One evening in late October, as the first real chill of winter began to creep across the Kansas prairie, Ryder arrived at her door with an unusual request. The Harrison Ranch is having a gathering this Saturday, he said. Just the ranch hands and some folks from town. There will be music and dancing and food. I was hoping you might come with me. Penelope's first instinct was to refuse. She had avoided social gatherings since Thomas's death, finding it easier to remain alone than to face the pity in people's eyes. But looking at Ryder's hopeful expression, she realized that hiding from life was no longer serving her. It was time to step back into the world, to claim her place among the living rather than existing in the gray space between grief and existence. I would be happy to go with you, she said, and meant it. The gathering was everything Ryder had promised and more. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across acres of good grazing land, its main house, a solid structure of wood and stone that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Lanterns hung from the porch and trees, casting warm pools of light into the darkness, and the sound of fiddle music drifted across the yard. Penelope felt nervous as Ryder helped her down from the wagon he had borrowed for the occasion, but his steady presence beside her provided an anchor in the swirl of activity. People greeted them warmly, and if some gave Penelope curious looks, wondering about the widow who had finally emerged from her self-imposed isolation, no one said anything unkind. She recognized several of her clients among the crowd, men whose clothes she had mended over the past 2 years, and they tipped their hats to her respectfully. It felt strange to be seen as something other than just the widow doing piecework, to be acknowledged as a woman in her own right with a life beyond her needle and thread. When the dancing began, Ryder led her onto the makeshift floor that had been cleared in the barn. Penelope had not danced since her wedding, but her body remembered the steps, and Ryder was a surprisingly graceful partner for such a large man. They spun and swayed to the fiddle's cheerful tune, and for the first time in 2 years, Penelope felt truly happy. During a break in the music, they stepped outside to catch their breath. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Ryder draped his jacket over Penelope's shoulders without asking, a gesture of care that had become familiar over the weeks of their courtship. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his voice soft in the darkness. "It means more to me than you might realize, having you here beside me." "I should be thanking you," Penelope replied, "for being patient with me, for giving me a reason to start living again instead of just surviving." Ryder turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Penelope, I know it has only been a few weeks, but I need you to know something. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the moment you opened your door and looked at my sorry pile of clothes with kindness instead of judgment. I do not expect you to feel the same way, not yet, but I wanted you to know where I stand." Penelope's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at this man who had come into her life with a sack of torn clothing, and somehow managed to mend the tears in her heart as carefully as she had repaired his garments. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared and the grief his loss had brought. She had believed that kind of love was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, that she had used up her allotment of happiness and would spend the rest of her days alone. But standing there in the starlight with Ryder's warm hands on her face and his green eyes searching hers with such hope and vulnerability, Penelope realized that the heart was not a finite resource. Love was not something that could be used up or exhausted. It was a renewable thing, capable of healing and growing and finding new expressions even after being shattered. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "It terrifies me, but it is true." Ryder kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. It was nothing like kissing Thomas had been, yet it was perfect in its own right, a new chapter beginning even as the old one remained honored and remembered. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, Penelope felt as though she could finally see her future stretching out before her, full of possibility and promise. The winter that followed was the happiest Penelope had known in years. Ryder courted her properly, with the patience and dedication he brought to everything he did. He would finish his work at the Harrison Ranch and come to her room, where they would sit together while she sewed, and he read aloud from books borrowed from the town's small library. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears with the kind of honesty that only comes when two people truly trust each other. Penelope finished mending his clothes in early December, 3 months after he had first knocked on her door. She presented the final garment, a shirt she had practically reconstructed from scratch, with a sense of accomplishment tempered by melancholy. The work that had brought them together was complete, and she found herself wondering what would happen now that there was no practical reason for Ryder to keep visiting. Her fears proved groundless. Ryder took the shirt, examined her meticulous work with genuine appreciation, then set it aside and pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small ruby that caught the lamplight. "Penelope Fairbanks," he said, dropping to one knee right there in her small room above the general store. "You have spent 3 months mending my clothes and somehow managed to mend my heart in the process. I came to Wilson looking for a new start, and I found everything I have ever wanted. Will you marry me?" Penelope felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy rather than grief. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed on a cold January morning in 1883 in the small church at the center of Wilson. Penelope wore her blue dress, the one she had worn on their first dinner together, and Ryder wore the clothes she had so carefully mended, every stitch a testament to the care they had built between them. The ceremony was simple, attended by the people of Wilson who had watched Penelope survive her grief, and now rejoiced to see her find happiness again. After the wedding, Ryder surprised her with news that he had been saving for the right moment. "The Harrison Ranch has offered me a permanent position," he said as they stood together outside the church. "Not just as a hired hand, but as foreman. It comes with a house, small but sturdy on the edge of the ranch property. I know it is not much, but it is ours if you want it." Penelope laughed, the sound bright and free. "Not much. Ryder, I have been living in a single room for 2 years. A house sounds like a palace." They moved into the foreman's house that very week. It was indeed small, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but to Penelope it was perfect. She set up her sewing materials in the corner of the main room, continuing to take in mending work not out of necessity now, but because she enjoyed the craft and the connection it gave her to the community. Ryder threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, taking pride in his new responsibilities and the respect they brought. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. In March, a late blizzard struck Kansas, dumping 2 feet of snow across the prairie and trapping them in the house for nearly a week. Penelope worried about running out of firewood and food, but Ryder had prepared well, stocking the small shed behind the house with supplies enough to last them through the worst of it. They spent the days huddled by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together, and Penelope discovered that being snowbound with the right person was not a hardship at all. In May, Ryder's younger brother arrived unexpectedly, riding into the ranch yard on a horse that looked ready to drop from exhaustion. Ryder McCormick was 22 and angry at the world, full of the same restless energy that had driven Ryder onto the trail 5 years earlier. He had left the family ranch after their father's death, unwilling to stay and work land that reminded him too much of what they had lost. Ryder welcomed his brother with open arms, but Robert's presence brought tension to the small house. He was rude and dismissive, particularly toward Penelope, whom he seemed to view as an interloper in his brother's life. The situation came to a head one evening when Robert made a cutting remark about Penelope's mending work, suggesting that Ryder had married beneath himself. Ryder's response was immediate and fierce. "You will apologize to my wife right now, or you will leave this house and not return." Robert stared at his brother in shock, unused to seeing Ryder's temper. "I was just making a joke. It was not funny. Penelope is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I will not tolerate you or anyone else disrespecting her. She has survived more in her 25 years than you can possibly imagine, and she has done it with grace and dignity. If you cannot see the strength in that, the value in honest work done well, then you have learned nothing from our father's death." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Then, slowly, Robert turned to Penelope. "I apologize, madam. That was uncalled for. I have been carrying around a lot of anger, and I should not have directed it at you." Penelope accepted the apology with quiet dignity, and from that moment forward, Robert began to change. He stayed on at the Harrison Ranch, taking work as a regular hand, and slowly the anger that had driven him began to ease. He watched the way Ryder and Penelope were together, the respect and love that flowed between them, and something in him seemed to settle. By the time he left Wilson that fall to return to the family ranch and claim his inheritance, he was a different man than the one who had arrived. The years flowed past like water. Penelope and Ryder built a life together that was rich in all the ways that mattered, filled with love and laughter and hard work. In the spring of 1884, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy tinged with anxiety, for they both knew the dangers that childbirth could bring. The pregnancy was difficult. Penelope was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep down food, and Ryder hovered over her like a worried hen. As her belly grew, so did his concern, and Penelope found herself having to reassure him constantly that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, and she was strong enough to handle it. Their son was born on a frigid December night, arriving 3 weeks early in a rush that left no time to fetch the doctor from town. Ryder delivered his own child with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, and when he placed the squalling infant in Penelope's arms, she saw a love in his eyes so profound it took her breath away. They named him Thomas, after her first husband, a gesture that honored the past while embracing the future. Ryder never showed a moment of jealousy about the name, understanding that Penelope's love for him did not diminish what she had felt before, just as new love did not erase old grief. Little Thomas was healthy and strong, with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he brought a new dimension of joy to their lives. 2 years later, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. She was smaller than Thomas had been, more delicate, but she had a will of iron from her first breath. Ryder was even more protective of his daughter than he had been of his son, a fact that Penelope teased him about mercilessly. Watching her husband cradle their tiny daughter and sing her to sleep with old cowboy ballads was one of the sweetest sights Penelope had ever witnessed. Life on the Harrison Ranch continued to prosper. Ryder's reputation as a skilled horseman and fair foreman spread throughout Kansas, and men sought work at the ranch specifically to learn from him. He taught them not just about horses and cattle, but about the value of honest work and treating others with respect. The lessons he had learned from his own wandering years, the regrets he carried about time wasted and relationships neglected, informed everything he did. Penelope expanded her mending work into a small tailoring business, making new clothes as well as repairing old ones. She hired 2 other women from Wilson to help her, widows like she had been, who needed work and the dignity that came with earning their own living. Together, they produced garments of such quality that people came from neighboring towns to commission pieces, and Penelope found satisfaction in creating opportunities for others the way Ryder's simple request for mending had created opportunity for her. In 1888, when Thomas was 4 and Rose was 2, Ryder came home one evening with news that he had been saving for weeks. "The Harrison family is selling the ranch," he said, his voice carefully neutral. They are moving back east to live with their daughter, and they have offered to sell me the foreman's house and 50 acres of the ranch land at a price I can actually afford. Penelope set down the shirt she had been sewing and stared at her husband. 50 acres. Ryder, that is enough land to start our own operation. I know. It is not as large as my father's ranch was, but it is ours. We could run cattle, breed horses, build something for Thomas and Rose to inherit. He paused, vulnerability creeping into his expression. But it would mean taking on debt, putting everything we have saved into the down payment. It is a risk, and I will not make that decision without you. Penelope thought about the scared widow she had been 6 years earlier, living in a single room and surviving on coins earned one stitch at a time. She thought about the courage it had taken to open her door to a stranger with a sack of torn clothes, to accept his invitation to dinner, to risk her heart on love again. Every good thing in her life had come from taking chances, from being willing to step into uncertainty with hope instead of fear. We take the risk, she said firmly. We build something together, something that will last beyond us. They bought the land and the house, signing papers that made them property owners and debtors in equal measure. The work was hard, harder than anything they had done before. Ryder worked sunrise to sunset building fences and corrals while Penelope managed the household and her business and the children. There were times when the debt seemed crushing, when a hard winter or a dry summer threatened to undo everything they had built. But they persevered, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the victories together. Slowly, year by year, the ranch grew. They acquired cattle, built a small herd of quality horses, and gained a reputation for fair dealing and good stock. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the horses, almost as much as his father did, while Rose proved to have a gift for numbers that she applied to managing the ranch's finances with a precision that amazed her parents. In 1892, Penelope gave birth to their third child, another boy they named James. He came easier than the first two, born on a warm spring morning with birds singing outside the window and his father holding Penelope's hand through every contraction. James was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to cry, and he brought a lightness to the household that balanced the seriousness of his older siblings. The ranch continued to thrive. By 1895, they had paid off half the debt and expanded their holdings by another 20 acres. Ryder hired hands to help with the heavy work, remembering his own days as a drifting cowboy and making sure his employees were treated with respect and paid fairly. Several of the men who worked for them ended up settling in Wilson permanently, starting families of their own and becoming part of the community. Penelope's tailoring business grew as well. She moved the operation into a storefront in Wilson proper, creating a shop that became a gathering place for the town's women. She employed 6 seamstresses now, and together they produced everything from simple work clothes to elaborate wedding dresses. The income from the business provided a financial cushion that allowed the ranch to weather hard times, and Penelope took pride in the independence it gave her. One evening in the spring of 1897, 15 years after Ryder had first knocked on her door with a sack of torn clothes, Penelope stood on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over land that belonged to them. Thomas was 17 now, tall and strong like his father, already managing much of the day-to-day ranch work. Rose was 15, keeping the books with meticulous care and talking about going to college back east to study business. James was 5, running through the yard with the kind of wild energy that only small boys possessed. Ryder came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Everything," Penelope replied. I was remembering the woman I was when we met, how small my world had become. And now look at all this. 3 children, a thriving ranch, a business, a life so full it sometimes seems impossible that one person could contain it all. We contain it together, Ryder said. That is the secret, I think. Neither of us could have built this alone, but together we can handle anything. Penelope turned in his arms to face him. At 47, Ryder had lines around his eyes and silver threading through his dark hair, but he was still the same man who had stood at her door all those years ago, asking her to mend his clothes and somehow mending her broken heart in the process. You ever regret it? She asked. Giving up the wandering life, settling down here in Wilson, Ryder smiled, that same smile that had first made her heart skip. Not for a single second. Those 5 years on the trail taught me what I did not want. The 15 years with you have shown me everything I do want. You, our children, this land, this life we have built together. I would not trade it for anything. They stood together on the porch as the stars began to emerge, holding each other while their children played in the yard and the horses nickered softly in the corral. It was a simple moment, unremarkable in many ways, but to Penelope it contained everything that mattered. This was what she had been stitching toward all along, she realized, from that first needle pushed through worn fabric to this life they had created together, thread by patient thread. The years continued their march. Thomas married a girl from a neighboring ranch in 1899, a sweet-natured young woman named Sarah who fit into the family as though she had always been there. They built a house on the far edge of the property and began raising their own children, giving Penelope and Ryder their first grandchildren. Rose did go east to college, studying business at a women's college in Massachusetts. But she returned to Wilson after graduation, bringing with her ideas for expanding both the ranch and the tailoring business into new markets. James grew into a young man with his mother's creativity and his father's steady nature. He showed no interest in ranching, preferring instead to work with Penelope in the tailoring shop. His eye for design and color elevated the business to new heights, and together they began producing garments that were featured in catalogs distributed throughout Kansas and neighboring states. In 1905, on their 22nd wedding anniversary, Ryder took Penelope on a trip they had been planning for years. They traveled by train to San Francisco, leaving the children and grandchildren to manage the ranch and business, and spent 2 glorious weeks exploring the city and the California coast. It was Penelope's first time seeing the ocean, and she stood on the beach with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the vast beauty of it. I never imagined anything like this, she said, her hand tight in Ryder's. When I was sitting in that small room above the general store, measuring my life in stitches and coins, I could not have dreamed that someday I would stand beside the ocean with the man I love. You gave me a life, Ryder replied. When I came to you, I was lost. I had clothes that were falling apart and a soul to match. You mended both, Penelope. Everything good in my life flows from that moment when you opened your door and took a chance on a stranger with nothing to offer but torn shirts and hope. They returned to Wilson renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever came next. Ryder was 55 now, his body showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but his spirit remained strong. He worked the ranch with Thomas and his growing crew of hands, teaching his grandson the same lessons he had learned the hard way about the value of honest work and fair dealing. Penelope, at 47, still ran her tailoring business with the same dedication she had brought to that first pile of mending work. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis now, making the detailed work harder, but she refused to give up the craft that had saved her life. She taught her granddaughters to sew, passing down skills and wisdom that stretched back through generations of women who had supported themselves and their families with needle and thread. In the winter of 1907, a flu swept through Wilson, hitting the very young and the very old the hardest. Penelope and Ryder nursed several of their grandchildren through the sickness, terrified of losing the precious lives that represented their future. For weeks the outcome hung in the balance, and Penelope found herself praying with a fervor she had not felt since Thomas's final days. The children recovered, but the scare left both Penelope and Ryder shaken. They realized that time was no longer an infinite resource, that the years stretching ahead were fewer than those that lay behind. It made them treasure each moment more carefully, finding joy in the simple act of sitting together at the end of a long day, in watching their children and grandchildren thrive, in knowing they had built something that would outlast them. On a warm evening in May 1910, the ranch held a celebration for Ryder's 60th birthday. The entire family gathered, along with what seemed like half of Wilson, to honor the man who had become a pillar of the community. There was food and music and dancing, and Ryder spent the evening surrounded by the people whose lives he had touched over nearly 3 decades in Kansas. When the party wound down and the guests began to depart, Penelope and Ryder stood together watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Their children and grandchildren had gone to their various homes, leaving the old house quiet for the first time in days. 60 years, Ryder said wonderingly. I never thought I would live to see 60. There were times on the trail when I did not think I would see 30. I am glad you did, Penelope replied, leaning into his warmth. I am glad you lived long enough to find your way to my door with that sack of torn clothes. Ryder laughed, the sound deep and genuine. I still have some of those clothes, you know, packed away in the trunk in the attic. I could not bear to throw them out after all the work you put into them. They were my masterwork, Penelope said with a smile. Every stitch an act of faith, a hope that something broken could be made whole again. You did not just mend my clothes, Penelope. You mended me. You took a broken man and made him whole, gave him a reason to put down roots and build a life. I was lost before you, drifting without purpose or direction. You gave me everything. Penelope turned to face her husband, this man who had been her partner and her love for 28 years. We gave each other everything. You brought me back to life when I thought I would spend the rest of my days in gray solitude. You showed me that hearts are resilient things, capable of loving again even after breaking. We healed each other, Ryder. That is what love does. They went inside together, climbing the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for so many years. The house was quiet around them, filled with memories of laughter and tears, of children raised and challenges overcome, of a life built stitch by careful stitch into something beautiful and lasting. The years that followed were gentler. Ryder gradually handed over more of the ranch management to Thomas, though he still rose early each morning to check on the horses and walk the property that had become his home. Penelope reduced her hours at the tailoring shop, spending more time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who were beginning to arrive with increasing frequency. They took pleasure in small things: morning coffee shared on the porch, evening walks through the pastures, Sunday dinners with the entire family crowded into the house that somehow always managed to hold one more person. They watched Wilson grow from a small frontier town into a proper community, with schools and churches and businesses that served people for miles around. They saw automobiles arrive, watched as the world changed around them, but they remained constant in their love for each other and the life they had built. In 1915, on a clear autumn morning much like the one when they had first met, Ryder had a stroke while working in the barn. Thomas found him and brought him to the house, and the doctor came quickly, but there was little to be done. The right side of Ryder's body was paralyzed, his speech slurred, and it was clear that his working days were over. Penelope nursed him with the same dedication she had shown Thomas 3 decades earlier, but this time the outcome was different. Ryder was stubborn and strong, and though he never fully recovered, he regained enough function to move around with a cane and communicate clearly. The stroke aged him rapidly, turning him from a vigorous 65-year-old man into someone who looked and moved like he was 80. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Penelope undiminished. They adapted to this new reality, finding ways to maintain their connection despite Ryder's limitations. Penelope would read to him for hours, everything from newspapers to novels to agricultural reports. He would tell her stories of his youth, memories of his father and the ranch he had grown up on, tales of the trail that he had never shared before. It was as though the stroke had unlocked something in him, a willingness to examine his past and make peace with choices made and roads not taken. "I am sorry," he said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. His speech was still halting, the words requiring effort, but the sentiment was clear. "Sorry that you have to take care of me. You have already nursed one husband through illness. You should not have to do it again." "Hush," Penelope said gently, taking his hand. "This is what love means, Ryder, being there for each other in sickness and in health, in youth and in age. You have given me 33 years of happiness. Caring for you now is not a burden, it is a privilege." Ryder lived for 3 more years after the stroke. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with family dinners and quiet evenings, with the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. He died peacefully in his sleep on a warm June night in 1918, with Penelope beside him as she had been for so many nights before. The grief that followed was profound, but different from what Penelope had experienced when Thomas died. She was 60 years old now, and while the loss of Ryder left a hole in her life that could never be filled, she was surrounded by the evidence of their love. 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren all carried pieces of Ryder forward into the future. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive under Thomas's management. The tailoring business bore her name and employed women throughout the county. Everything she looked at contained memories of the life they had shared. Penelope lived for another 15 years, remaining active in the business and the community until the very end. She spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories to her great-great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had come to her door with a sack of torn clothes and somehow managed to mend her broken heart. She spoke of hard times and good times, of the resilience required to build a life from nothing, of the power of love to transform and heal. She died in her sleep on a cold January morning in 1933, 3 months shy of her 75th birthday. They buried her beside Ryder in the cemetery on the hill, overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her children and grandchildren gathered to mourn her passing and celebrate her life, sharing memories and tears and laughter. At the funeral, Rose stood to speak about her mother. She told the assembled family and friends about Penelope's journey from grieving widow to successful businesswoman, from a woman living on coins earned 1 stitch at a time to a matriarch who had built an empire through determination and skill. But mostly she spoke about love, about the courage it took to open her heart after loss, about the leap of faith required to trust in happiness again. "My mother taught me that broken things can be mended," Rose said, her voice strong despite her tears. "That with patience and care and the willingness to try, even the most damaged garment can be made whole again." She proved it first with my father's clothes, and then with his heart, and finally with her own life. She took scraps and fragments and stitched them into something beautiful and lasting. That is her legacy to us, the knowledge that nothing is beyond repair if we are willing to do the work. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Thomas's line, expanding and evolving with the times but remaining true to the values Penelope and Ryder had established. The tailoring business eventually closed as the world changed, and mass-produced clothing became the norm. But the building that had housed it was preserved and turned into a small museum celebrating the history of Wilson and the women who had helped build it. In that museum, in a place of honor, sits a glass case containing several garments. They are old shirts and trousers, mended so skillfully that the repairs are nearly invisible, each stitch a testament to the care taken in their creation. A placard beside the case tells the story of Penelope Fairbanks and Ryder McCormick, the widow and the cowboy whose love story began with torn clothing and grew into something that shaped an entire community. The story of how a desperate cowboy brought a lifetime's worth of mending work to a struggling widow became part of Wilson's folklore, told and retold with each generation. It became more than just a romance, though it was certainly that. It became a parable about resilience and second chances, about the courage required to risk your heart after loss, about the transformative power of love when combined with honest work and mutual respect. Young couples visiting Wilson would make pilgrimages to the cemetery on the hill, standing before the shared headstone that read Penelope and Ryder McCormick, together forever, and make promises to each other about building lives that would last. The museum became a popular destination for school trips, where children would marvel at the ancient clothes and learn about the woman who had supported herself through skill and determination, and the man who had seen her value when she could barely see it herself. The house where Penelope and Ryder had raised their family stood for nearly a century before finally being torn down, but before it was demolished, family members salvaged what they could. The trunk containing Ryder's original clothes, the ones Penelope had mended all those years ago, was preserved and passed down through the generations. Each new recipient of the trunk would open it carefully, remove the tissue-wrapped garments, and marvel at the precision of the stitching, the care evident in every repair. Those clothes became family heirlooms, physical proof that broken things could be mended, that what seemed beyond repair could be made whole again with patience and love. They served as a reminder that the most valuable things in life often came wrapped in humble packages. That opportunity could knock in the form of a dusty cowboy carrying a sack of torn clothing. That love could be found in the most unexpected places if you were brave enough to open your door and your heart. The story of Penelope and Ryder became woven into the fabric of Wilson's history, as much a part of the town's identity as the grain elevators and the railroad tracks and the endless Kansas prairie that surrounded it. Their love story proved that even in the harsh reality of frontier life, where survival often took precedence over sentiment, there was room for romance and tenderness, and the kind of love that transformed ordinary lives into something extraordinary. In the end, what began with a widow mending clothes for coins and a cowboy who brought enough work to last a lifetime became a legacy that stretched across generations. It proved that love was not a finite resource but a renewable one, capable of healing old wounds and creating new possibilities. It showed that second chances were real, that grief did not have to be permanent, that broken hearts could beat strong again if given the right care and attention. Penelope and Ryder's story demonstrated that the greatest love stories were not always the ones that happened to young people in the first flush of life. but sometimes to those who had already known loss and learned the true value of connection. Their love was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values, strengthened by hard work and common goals, and sustained by a deep and abiding affection that only grew stronger with time. They proved that a life well lived was measured not in wealth or status, but in love given and received, in children raised and communities served, in the small acts of kindness and care that accumulated over time into something magnificent. They showed that ordinary people doing ordinary work could create extraordinary legacies if they approached their tasks with integrity and their relationships with honesty. The story of the widow who mended clothes for coins and the cowboy who brought enough work to last a lifetime became more than just a tale of two people who fell in love. It became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of hope in the face of loss, to the possibility of new beginnings no matter how final the endings might seem. It reminded everyone who heard it that love was always worth the risk, that opening your heart might lead to pain, but could also lead to joy beyond imagining. And so, in a small town in Kansas, in a cemetery on a hill where two people who had found each other against all odds were buried side by side, their story lived on. It was told in hushed tones by parents to children, shared with pride by descendants who carried their blood and their values forward into new centuries, preserved in museums and family Bibles, and the collective memory of a community they had helped to build. Penelope Fairbanks and Ryder McCormick had started with almost nothing, a pile of torn clothes and a willingness to take a chance on each other. And from that humble beginning, they had built an empire of love that touched countless lives and lasted long after they were gone. Their story proved that the most valuable things could not be bought or sold, only created through patience and care, and the kind of deep commitment that saw past surface damage to the potential beneath. They had mended each other as carefully as Penelope had mended those first shirts and trousers, stitch by patient stitch, day by precious day, until what was broken became whole again, stronger for having been repaired. And in doing so, they created something that lasted not just a lifetime, but for generations beyond. A love story that proved that sometimes the best things in life came to those who were brave enough to pick up the pieces and start over, to believe in second chances and the transformative power of love.